Voluntold, we used to call it.
I talk long enough. I know how that is.
Yeah.
You keep walking at me. I don't want to get choked. She's probably going to watch.
Hello. Hello. Good morning, committee. Hey. Thank you, Vice Chair. Good morning, committee and guests. Welcome to our second day in our request for information on water and the committee. And we're glad you could make it. Appreciate the attendance. And the staff did inform me that any of the information that's been passed out we have is available on the website now. We can get it if you need it. So that's important that you know that. So today we got not a short day, but the agenda, we have two remaining conferees to talk and visit with us today. So and we'll start with Professor Griggs, and he'll give us his ideas on water and law and all the things necessary for it. So welcome to the committee, Professor.
Thank you, Senator, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak before the committee. I have a PowerPoint that is being operated remotely. Robin in a different room will be doing that, so I'll be asking Robin to change slides as I go through. Thanks for inviting me to speak, but also thank you sincerely for not asking me to survey and to explain all of Kansas water law in 50 minutes. I've provided that survey numerous times since 2017, and I think you have written testimony on file to that effect. Next slide, please. What I'd like to discuss today is something that is more complicated and more politically troublesome than just providing a legal lecture. The law is not really the problem. For the most part, Kansas has good water law, and this is a very skeletal summary. We have unitary regulation of groundwater and surface water, something that Nebraska does not have, something that Texas, California, and Arizona do not have. One of the reasons they have so many problems is they don't have that. We have statewide jurisdiction over water rights. Mr. Lewis, chief engineer, has jurisdiction over groundwater and surface water. That makes the ability to protect property rights much more effective than in states that delegate the regulation of water rights to local districts. All of our water rights, except for domestic rights, are quantified, which means people know what they own, or at least what they have a claim to. There are clear property protections under the prior appropriation doctrine, and the state has clear regulatory powers. The problem is, with law like this, why do we have such serious water problems? And that's what I want to talk about today. That's the problem you need to confront, a problem that you can do a lot to resolve. And I have some general recommendations for the problem. They are not original. We have discussed these for years. So let us begin with our principal water problems. Next slide, please. We have three basic problems. First, not to put too fine a point on it, we're running out of water. If you'll go to the next slide, please. This is a slide that should haunt your dreams. You've seen it a couple, 300 times. This is the Kansas Geological Survey's map of the depletion maps of the High Plains Ogallala Aquifer. If you go to the next slide, please. This is what groundwater depletion does to our surface streams. You'll notice on the left side of that map, western Kansas, most of those streams are in red. Those are streams that used to be perennial. Now they are ephemeral. They no longer run except for during high precipitation events. At a cumulative level, what this means is groundwater pumping in western Kansas is starving the streams of central and eastern Kansas. The Smoky Hill River meets the Republican River in Junction City. The Smoky Hill is being depleted because of upstream groundwater pumping in Kansas. The Republican River is being depleted because of upstream groundwater pumping in Nebraska. People who live in the central and eastern parts of the states have a serious interest in groundwater depletion. It is not a local problem because, as our law has recognized since 1945, groundwater and surface water are connected. So if you can go back to 2 slides back to slide 3. Thank you. Go back. One more. Okay. Second problem. We are allowing the contamination and the poisoning of our surface streams, especially our interstate streams from the west. Nitrate, phosphorus, sulfate, chloride, uranium, selenium, other toxic metals and chemicals. The committee heard about this yesterday. The committee also learned that our largest users of water, agricultural users, are generally not regulated under the Clean Water Act, and so they have become, with no fault of their own, the largest polluters of water in this country. It used to be industrial users, but the Clean Water Act cleaned up a lot of industrial use. The third problem is we have turned our back on water as a public resource. The waters of this state are dedicated to the people of this state. The state has a permanent and irrefutable claim to the waters of this state. So why then, given these problems, why aren't they going away when we have such good water law? Well, this is a general problem in the law. The law is a set of formal, official, publicly enforceable rules. But even when that law is good law, it doesn't necessarily follow that property owners, state officials, and the public use that law. We have crafted excellent legal tools. You should be proud of these tools as members of the legislature. But we have decided, for the most part, not to use them. And why is that? That's the nut I'm going to try and crack a little bit. Let's return to our three principal water problems. So Robin, if you could go ahead to slide 6, past the happy maps. Okay, I'm going to talk about this for quite some time. I'll try and be economical about it. There are three main reasons why, if you can go back one more slide, to why we're running out of water. The first is we made a major compromise to our water law in 1957. The Fundamental Water Code of 1945 set a hard rule. If any new water right and the use of that water would impair existing rights, that water right would not be granted. Some states still follow this hard rule. Nevada has used this hard rule to protect upstate, northern, and central Nevada ranchers from groundwater diversions by the city of Las Vegas. Irrigators in the San Luis Valley of southern Colorado have used this rule to protect cities on the Front Range of Colorado and as far south as Albuquerque from taking water from the valley and transporting it to urban areas. But in 1957, you, the legislature, had a choice. You had this massive groundwater supply called the High Plains Ogallala Aquifer. It was there waiting to be exploited. Other states without such good water laws, our 1945 Act, were pumping without any concern, without any permitting, without any laws on groundwater. The legislature changed the standards for granting new water rights. The chief engineer has a duty to put water to beneficial use if such a use does not impair existing rights. But because the Ogallala is, for the most part, in our state, not renewable, any new water right on the Ogallala would start to impair existing rights. That's just physics, that's just math. And this put the chief engineer in a tough spot. What principle of our water law should we favor? Should we favor the principle of beneficial use, duty to put beneficial use, water to beneficial use, or the principle of first in time, first in right? The legislature in 1957 made that decision for him. It softened the standard for granting new water rights. New water rights could be granted even if they would lower the water table. And under this softened standard, the state began to issue tens of thousands of groundwater rights because it's the state's duty to put water to beneficial use. And so beneficial use expanded and exploded across western Kansas. And so for a while, the principle of beneficial use could be separated from the principle of priority. If you can go back a couple slides. One more. Okay, let's stay here for a while. I'll be here on this boring slide for a while. I do not have a degree in graphic design, as you can see. Okay, so we decided in 1957 to bankrupt our water system, to grant more water rights than we had water to supply them. There's a legal term for this. It's called bankruptcy. When a company has more debts than assets, it can go into bankruptcy. So how could the legislature make such a terrible mistake? Well, it actually thought about this issue. It studied this issue, and it thought it had a solution. And the solution was, look, we're going to soften the standard for new water rights. However, we're going to strengthen the tools that existing water rights owners have to protect their rights. What's the assumption there? The assumption there is that the water rights owners would take their own independent actions to protect their water rights, and that would address regional lowering of the water table. But that assumption was mistaken. Next slide, please. People have not generally protected their water rights using the prior appropriation doctrine to protect senior water rights against junior owners, even though our law is extremely clear on this issue. If you have a senior water right and it is being impaired by a junior right, you have the right to go to the chief engineer, and then the chief engineer has the non-discretionary right to shut down junior water rights to protect a senior right. The chief engineer has a great deal of discretion in how he will administer junior rights, but there is no discretion on the issue of protecting the property rights of senior water rights owners. That's the essence of the legal protections of the 1945 Act. We've got tens of thousands of water rights across western state Kansas, but over the last 20 or 30 years, fewer than 50 impairment complaints have been filed with DWR. So if you are suffering the water equivalent of trespass, the water equivalent of nuisance, someone with a junior water right is messing with your well, their pumping is depleting the well for your property, you would think, an economist would think, the rational thing to do is to go out and call the state and have the neighbors shut down. But that is not how it's worked. And I think it shows you one of the problems with that assumption that private property owners would suffer the burden and shoulder the cost of protecting their own water rights. Just because that tool of protecting your water right is out there does not mean you have to use it. Just because that tool is out there does not mean the chief engineer has an independent duty to come in and administer water rights on his own invitation. It's a property right that you have, just as you have the right to call the sheriff and kick a trespasser off your property. You need the sheriff to do that. You need the chief engineer to come in and protect your water right. So why aren't owners protecting their rights? Well, a lot of this has to do with local relationships and being sensitive to how these irrigators and the people who buy their grain and the feedlots and the plants are interdependent. Also, a lot of owners own senior water rights and junior water rights. You might own a 1952 water right, congratulations, but you might also own 3 or 4 water rights granted in the late 70s, stacked on top of that older water right for the same farm ground. Are you going to call the chief engineer so that he can shut down 3 of your 4 rights? Probably not, okay? The cost of defending these rights can be expensive. So what I would say is what I've written in an article a long time ago. You know, we talk about a tragedy of the commons. That's not what we're seeing here. We have individually assigned, defensible, protectable water rights. You can't pump water in this state without a permit. What we have instead is a farce. It's not a tragedy, it's a farce. When you have tens of thousands of water rights and fewer than 100 impairment complaints, which the state acts on quickly and with great expertise. And that leads me to the third reason for why we are running out of water. Next slide, please.
The state is not using its regulatory tools, and I don't mean that as a criticism of any chief engineer. We've been fortunate to have excellent chief engineers. Chief engineer has powerful tools for reducing groundwater pumping. The courts have affirmed the legality of those tools repeatedly. The chief engineer could reduce groundwater pumping across the state today. It might take a little longer than today, but if you followed the assumptions of the legislature since 1945, theoretically, hypothetically, this could happen. Chief engineer could develop a plan. He could go to the governor and the attorney general with the following message: I've got a plan. I'm going to get sued. Do you have my back? I don't know if that meeting's ever taken place, but you can imagine how that meeting might work, how that meeting might go, okay? If he got sued, provided he was following the law, the odds are very high he would prevail. The statutes give the chief engineer clear authority to deal with groundwater quantity depletion, to deal with water quality contamination, and to bring groundwater pumping into a rough balance with what the aquifer can supply. So you might be asking, why hasn't Mr. Lewis or Mr. Barfield or Mr. Pope, the three chief engineers I worked under, well, I didn't work under Mr. Lewis, but I worked with him. Why haven't they done this? And this gets me to three reasons on this front. You've got a Water Appropriation Act which says there's a duty on behalf of the chief engineer to conserve the water supplies of the state of Kansas. But those maps belie that statutory charge. The first problem is that the chief engineer is subordinate to the Secretary of Agriculture. We are the only state in the union where the state water engineer is subordinate to a political appointee of the governor. What that means is we have a perfect conflict of interest built into our water law. Whether you are a Democratic or Republican Secretary of Ag, you generally come from the ag industry. I don't think the Sierra Club is going to produce a Secretary of Agriculture in my lifetime, okay? That's not their job. Their job is to promote agriculture. Their job is to look out for the best interests of agriculture. Generally speaking, we don't see secretaries of agriculture being all that concerned with the depletion of our water supplies. And so this is a serious structural problem. When water supplies run low, the Secretary of Agriculture is concerned about protecting water use by ag users, and ag users use 75 to 90% of the water in the state. Chief engineer's job is to protect water rights according to the prior appropriation doctrine. So this is quite a serious problem. And so next slide, please. Here's an illustration. If you get on the mission statement on the KDA website, it says their job is to serve, promote, and grow agriculture, the state's largest industry, employer, and economic contributor. Now, whether ag is the biggest industry in the state is a matter of debate. The Federal Department of Commerce doesn't agree with that. That's not the point. I'm not a statistician. The point is, the Department of Agriculture believes it's the largest industry in the state, and that's what matters politically. On the other side of that, you've got DWR's statutory duty in 82A706 to conserve and protect water rights. So, at the executive level of the governor, the attorney generals, and at the Department of Agriculture, there's been a bipartisan failure of nerve. And if you were a water rights owner who 40 or 50 years ago had a water right that could pump 600 gallons per minute, and now your well is crippled and you can't get to the 400 gallons per minute you need for 100 days on corn, you have a legitimate claim to say that the state is being negligent in protecting your property rights. So let me recap. Next slide, please. Another slide, please. We've chosen to enter water bankruptcy, and we have deliberately ignored its consequences since 1957. We've decided to reap short-term gains and to put most of the regulatory burden on private property owners, the owners of senior water rights. And we've tolerated a regulatory structure for water in this state that subordinates the protection of our water supplies to politics. So, what's the effective result of this neglect? The effective result is that the legislative and the executive branches have chosen to permanently deplete our water supplies. That is the unwritten but official and officially tolerated policy of this state. It's something you can change, and you can change this without disturbing most of the existing legal and regulatory structures of Kansas water law. Moving from bad news to worse news, next slide. The problem of contamination and water quality. This is a very serious problem. I would like to commend the Geological Survey for bringing to our attention the severity of the problem on the Ark River, in which Colorado is giving us, without us asking for it, 8 to 10 tons of uranium every year down the Ark River. We need a plan to stop this, most importantly, one that is upstream in Colorado. That's a very complicated issue. I'm happy to discuss it separately, but for now, all I want to do is make some things pretty clear about the Clean Water Act. Yesterday, Mr. Henning basically stated that it was difficult to regulate these upstream pollution problems because the Clean Water Act exempts return flows from irrigated agriculture. You put water on farm ground, some of it seeps back into the river. Downstream, pull water out of the river, put it back on the farm ground. By the time water reaches the state line, just west of Coolidge, it has been put to beneficial use anywhere between 8 and 12 times in Colorado. So these uranium and selenium and other metals are concentrating themselves in the river, largely because irrigators upstream are being quite efficient in their water use. Those return flows are, as Mr. Henning pointed out, statutorily exempt from needing permits under the Clean Water Act. But that's only the first half of the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act does have tools for non-point sources. And my time today is limited, but let me just summarize what those tools are. The first prong of the Clean Water Act deals with point sources. You are a polluter. You are a leather tannery. If you've ever seen Civil Action, the movie, that's a leather tannery, okay? They are dumping toxic heavy metals into a lake or a river somewhere in Massachusetts. The Clean Water Act imposes strict permitting requirements for point sources. But where this permitting requirement is not sufficient, the Clean Water Act has a backstop. It has a second prong, and that is water quality standards. And when you're talking about water quality standards, the focus is not on the individual polluter, the point source, but upon the body of water. The stretch of the river, the stretch of a river basin that is suffering from water quality impairment. And the states, along with EPA, have to periodically review water quality standards pursuant to EPA regulations. If those standards are deficient, EPA has the power to impose higher standards. The load allocations, the amount of nasty stuff in the water, they are within the power of the Clean Water Act to deal with under this second prong. Once these water quality standards are set, then the states set total maximum daily loads for how much can be allowed and tolerated in this water body. Mr. Stiles and KDHE worked with this. They are experts in this law. I just want to emphasize that the Clean Water Act does have the ability to address this. Has it done so with agriculture? No, for the most part. But EPA, Region 8 in Colorado, Region 7 in Kansas, that's one of the problems we deal with. We deal with two different regions of EPA. They can work together. I've heard that this committee has met with people in Colorado. That's great. But the CWA, the Clean Water Act, is not powerless to regulate these nasty things. Generally speaking, you can no longer sue another state because they're dumping nasty stuff in a river that flows into yours. That's trespass, that's nuisance, that's how we used to do it way back in the day. In the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s, the Chicago River was a whole mess, and the states of Michigan and Illinois were suing each other every couple of years because of all the water quality problems. Well, along comes the Clean Water Act and preempts those common law actions of trespass and nuisance. They preempt the federal common law, but they do not preempt other statutes. And I have heard from members of this committee, what about the Ark River Compact? That's a federal statute. It's a state law. There are two provisions in that compact. Article 1, the purposes of this compact is to promote the beneficial use of water. Can you put radioactive water to beneficial use? I would like to see an expert who's not thinking about building a nuclear reactor testify yes to that question. And Article 4D of the compact prohibits the material depletion of waters for beneficial use by the state of Colorado. That's the compact language we hung our 1985 lawsuit on, which reduced pumping in the Colorado River portion of the Ark River Basin by 50%. Colorado will hate that argument. Okay? I'm not saying this argument is a winner, but we have federal law that guarantees Kansas the beneficial use of the waters coming in from Colorado. And this brings me to the third problem. We have turned our back on water as a public resource. Little bit of history background here. We should be very proud in Kansas for establishing one of the most important principles in water law. And that is when a state sues another state because an upstream state, and trust me, it's always an upstream state, right? When a state sues an upstream state, it does not sue that upstream state on behalf of the 8 or 900 irrigators who may be depending upon the Ark River in 1902 with the associated ditches that flow from Hamilton County down to Garden City. The state sued the state of Colorado, and the Supreme Court said in 1902, and has said every time since, that when a state goes into court to represent the interests of the state, it does so on behalf of all of the citizens of the state. So that is federal law. The Supreme Court reaffirmed that principle in 1943. A bunch of irrigators in western Kansas were not happy at how Colorado continued to use all the waters of the Ark River. So these irrigators went in to district court in Colorado and sued. And the court said, wait a second. You can't, as a bunch of irrigators, sue the state of Colorado. You've got to bring the state to sue. And they dismissed that case. That's Colorado v. Kansas, 1943. And so all of this leads to the Ark River Compact in 1949, but it's the same sort of principle that leads to the Kansas Water Appropriation Act of 1945, which dedicated all of the waters of the state to the people of the state, subject to the rules of prior appropriation. That's not because, we don't have that language because the Sierra Club said, you got to communize our water supplies. Here come big bad irrigators. No. It's a legal principle that had been established under federal law starting in the 1930s. That water is a statewide public resource. And we see the same thing in the GMD Act, which refers to the public. But for too long, we've ignored this bedrock principle. We've severed the civic connections between the state's water supplies and the people, even though we are more dependent on our water supplies than ever before. And why is that? Next slide, please. Groundwater is part of the problem. Remember my first section on groundwater depletion? Well, in 1957, as you just heard, the state chose the beneficial use principle over the prior appropriation principle. And by the 1970s, people in western Kansas were very concerned about the problem of over-appropriation. More water rights than water. Water bankruptcy was looming. And so the people who were most engaged about this were the people in western Kansas. This leads to the GMD Act of 1972. It has led to subsequent amendments to the GMD Act, which allowed intensive groundwater use control areas, or IGUCAs, local enhanced management areas, or LEMAs, which reward local initiative to conserve groundwater. And so I'm going to linger on this slide. This is just language I completely plagiarized. It's what lawyers do. We get on Westlaw and we steal what the law says. I didn't write this, you guys did. The organic statute, the legislative declaration of the GMD Act, says it's the policy of this act to establish the right of local water users to determine their destiny. The right of local water users. And so it is declared in the public interest to permit the establishment of GMDs. The problem is the GMDs do not represent the water publics within their regional boundaries. The people, the municipalities, and the industries that all depend upon safe and dependable water supplies. Next slide. And this is not an accident. If you look at the voting provisions of 82A1021, to be an eligible voter, you either have to own more than 40 acres of rural land, land outside of a municipality, or you have to be a water user. That is, you have to have either a non-domestic water right or a domestic right. Domestic rights don't require permits, so as long as you're using more than 1 acre-foot a year, you qualify as a water user, but not in a city. If you're using that 1 acre-foot, it's got to be outside of a municipality. A municipality receives 1 vote to, quote, represent all of the persons within its corporate limits. That's an intentional way to narrow the number of people who can vote. And so what I have for the next 3 slides is called lawyer statistics. Next slide, please. I'm going to go through approximate populations of the GMDs and divide them by the approximate number of eligible voters within the GMDs. Where did I get these numbers? I got on the census website for the 2020 census, which has numbers county by county, okay? And then I was fortunate enough to have the GMDs send me information about their eligible voters. So GMD4, GMD2, and GMD3 sent me numbers, and I appreciate that. And all I did was divide them, okay? These numbers are probably not super accurate because I am ballparking the population numbers, and I'm using the approximate numbers of eligible voters provided by the GMDs. They have much more important things to do than answer emails from a professor. I appreciate the fact they've done that, but here's what we've got. GMD4 is within about 10 counties, and that sounds more impressive than it actually is because it doesn't have all that much land. And by that I mean the boundaries of GMD4. It does not have much land in Decatur, Wallace, Logan, or Gove counties, so I left those out because, you know, I have 0 degrees in statistics, right? So I reduced that to about 23,832 people. Based on GMD4 numbers, it has about 5,700 eligible voters who can vote in a GMD election. That's about 24%. But keep in mind that no one from a municipality can vote because the municipality votes on behalf of all of its members. If you go to the next slide, GMD2, these numbers are obviously highly skewed by the fact that Wichita gets a lot of its water from its well field and its participation in GMD2. The population of these 4 counties is about 650,000. GMD2 has about 4,400 eligible voters. So that's about 0.68 of 1%. So about 1 in 150 people can vote in GMD2 elections, but none of those people can be in Wichita. Next slide. GMD3. There are 12 counties in GMD3, total population of about 130,000 people. I left out Hamilton County because there's not much of GMD3 in Hamilton County, and I only included about half of Meade County, because if you look at the GMD maps, about half of Meade's in there, about half of it's out. So I cut Meade's population in half. That gives you a number of about 125,000 people. There are about 11,000 eligible voters in GMD3 elections. That's about 8.8% of the population within the GMD3 boundaries. But according to GMD3, only about 2 to 4% of that 11,000 are actually registered to vote. So again, using lawyer math, I took the average of 2 to 4%, 3%, divided that by 11,000, that's 303 voters that actually vote in GMD3 elections. So that's about 0.27 of 1% of the total population of GMD3. About 1 in 400 people can actually vote in GMD3 elections. None of those people live in Garden City or Dodge because they only receive 1 vote apiece. So next slide. Given these 3 major problems that I've discussed today, if you've got a statute in the GMD Act that gives local water users, not just water rights owners, the right to determine their destiny, but if the GMD Act's definition of water user produces an electorate of between 24% on the high end and 0.27 of 1% on the low end, do you really have an electoral system that gives the people of Western Kansas the right to determine their destiny on water use? This is a hard question, and electoral issues can always be complicated, but I think it shows you that starting in the 1950s and accelerating ever since, we've had fewer and fewer farmers growing more and more ground. The assumptions that there would be more farmers with 40 or more acres. How many, what's the average size of a farm in Western Kansas? It's going to be more than 40 acres. So these are economic and industry-wide developments that have forced rural depopulation on the ag industry. So I don't think there's a grand conspiratorial problem here. I'm just saying that the number of people voting has become completely out of whack with the populations in these communities. Next slide. So what do we do about it? I noticed none of you asked that question, so I'm not going to really spend much time on this. Well, here's what I would recommend anyway. Since you didn't pay me, I'm going to say this anyway. I want you to emphasize something that's really important in the water law, which is a reliance interest. It's one of the most important things in property law, right? I own something. Don't disturb the investments I've made. Don't disturb the things I have done to protect and enhance that property. I rely upon those things. These reliance interests have established our water law. They run back to the 19th century. We had the prior appropriation doctrine 60 years before we had the Water Appropriation Act. You, or at least your great-grandparents, had they been in the legislature in 1883, recognized the prior appropriation doctrine in Western Kansas. That's why the ditches in Finney County and upstream were able to be built. They didn't want to build those until they had legal protections that those water supplies would be protected. And then we expanded that prior appropriation doctrine statewide in 1945. So, regarding the problem that we're running out of water, let's revisit the three main sources. Next slide, I think. No, back one slide. First, there's the problem of over-appropriation. We are not breaking law in western Kansas. Groundwater irrigators, 99.9% of them, according to my mentor John Peck, comply with their water rights reporting obligations. The vast majority of them, over 95%, do not pump over their limits. This is not a problem of outlaws breaking the law. The problem is more water rights than there is water. In that extent, I would suggest, and I've written about this, that you think about an adjudication of water rights, which is basically a bankruptcy proceeding for water rights. It balances the system between how much water we have and how many claims we have to it. This would take the problem largely out of the political arena. Water rights adjudications have been an absolute nightmare in certain states. In Arizona, nightmare. In certain parts of California, nightmare. You know why? Because they have terrible groundwater law. You saw what Brownie Wilson and Dr. Butler talked about yesterday. We have the best water rights data in the world. We have the best water rights use reporting system in the world. Our quantitative capacity to understand and comprehend the effects of groundwater pumping is better than any other place on the planet. And we are leaving that tool in the shed, to the frustration of many people. An adjudication could use that data and avoid a lot of the headaches that have plagued Arizona and California and New Mexico water rights adjudications. Second thing I would recommend is you clarify the duties of the chief engineer. He has a lot of power. He is at the mercy of property rights owners, which the legislature has imposed the burden of regulating water use. Why should it be their job to fix this problem? So I would ask you to consider making that duty an affirmative duty. If you make that duty an affirmative duty, you won't need the governor or the attorney general and the chief engineer to fly against the political headwinds. And if you don't have such a clear duty, your implicit policy is essentially to drain the Ogallala. That duty could be local. GMDs could take the lead. They could be charged with that duty to reach a conservation plan. That is meaningful. This is what we see across the West. And we've seen it with the LEMA tool most successfully in GMD4. But think about interstate litigation. Here's a thought experiment. What if the Ark River flowed west instead of east? What if it originated in the headwaters of Wichita and then flowed past Great Bend, past Dodge, Garden City, past Coolidge, into Colorado? I think we'd be in a very different place with groundwater pumping right now, because Colorado would have sued us for what we've done to the Ogallala. So we need to recognize that given the depletion of the Ogallala and the decline in stream flows, that assigning blame to individual water rights owners, putting the onus on individual water rights owners to take this into their hands, depending upon an individualistic system of property rights, is not going to get the job done. It's not an effective remedy. Irrigators recognize this, and that's why they have taken the lead with the LEMA tool and at a smaller level with water conservation areas. Collective problems require collective solutions. Finally, the problem is that we tolerate, next slide please, a regulatory structure and a regulatory system that subordinates the protection of our water supplies to political considerations. We cannot tolerate this. If the state will not protect property rights in water, then where are we? The Division of Water Resources cannot be subordinate to a Secretary of Agriculture. It's like putting the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms in the same bureau as Health and Human Services. Okay? How well is that agency going to run? The chief engineer's decisions cannot be subject to a veto by the Secretary of Agriculture. That violates the Water Appropriation Act. So to restore our water supplies, we need to have a useful discussion about whether the voting rules for GMDs actually serve the public. I don't have a proposal for fixing them. I think that's complicated, and we need to have experts from the GMDs and experts from this body to wrestle with that. But the GMD voting rules do not serve the Kansans who live in cities and who bear the brunt of water treatment from irrigated agriculture. Cities absorb the regulatory costs of that. If you look at the reverse osmosis plant in Lakin, if you look at aquifer storage and recovery efforts in Wichita, think about what the ASR project does. It takes flood flows from the Little Ark River, which is impaired under the terms of the Clean Water Act, cleans those water supplies to safe drinking water act standards, injects it into the well field. The city of Wichita is bearing the regulatory burden of cleaning up irrigation pollution, which is the problem of thousands of irrigators, right? It's a collective problem. But the farmers can move. The dairies can move. Meat packing plants can move. They have moved. We've seen them move from California. We've seen them move from Arizona. But cities can't move, towns can't move. So if you don't start working on this, you can start working on a eulogy for a lot of the communities of Western Kansas. And with that, I'll stand for questions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Professor Griggs. We'll take a few questions here since at the completion of this talk. We'll start with Senator Dahl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Professor. Can you tell me, and just take Ground Management District number 3, how many non-Kansans own that ground?
I'm going to deflect that question. That sounds like an excellent question for this committee for GMD3. You could do a title search under the Open Records
Well,
Act.
I think you could look at any of the ground management because most of them now are people from the East Coast coming and buying the ground
Right.
and such. And the depletion of a lot of our towns in western Kansas has already happened because all the farms now are big. All moderate-sized farms are gone. Mm-hmm. So the other thing is the fines for overpumping. Situations like this, I've been told by the people who've done it that they will just go pay their fine before they even pump, right, because they're going to make more money by overpumping than they are now. So that would tell you that the fines are inadequate.
I've got a response to that. Two things. First of all, it would be economically rational just to pay to pump. Nebraska did that to us. The Supreme Court slapped them. Thank you for funding that litigation, by the way. DWR has addressed that, and I'll let DWR give you more details, but they have amended their penalty structure so that the penalties are not necessarily just in money. They can also be in cutting back future water use. So if you overpump by 100 acre-feet, knowing you're going to, the standard remedy is now for the next year, you'll be cut by 100 acre-feet. Or you may be cut more. But who has the ability to reverse the decision to find an irrigator levied by the chief engineer? The Secretary of Agriculture.
Yeah, that
82A 737.
Can I have one more question? And explain to me, you know, I was a school teacher and a coach. I don't understand a lot of this stuff. But you talked about the depletion of Ocala. Mm-hmm. Has a major impact on central and eastern Kansas that are not involved with that Ogallala.
Right.
I don't know geology at all. So
All
explain.
you need to know is groundwater and surface water are connected. It's just a matter of time.
So that's down the road.
We already see much lower flows in the Smoky Hill. I mean, I picked that because it's the most prominent example of a really big river system that's been harmed by groundwater pumping, by thousands of irrigation water rights.
Directly related to the Ogallala.
That depends on where the Ogallala is. It's complicated. A lot of Ogallala supplies are not connected to stream flows, and that's an important point to make. Okay? As you know, as Dr. Butler and Brownie pointed out yesterday, it's a highly variable formation. In some areas, groundwater pumping has more of an impact on stream flows. In other areas, it has less of an impact.
So the Smoky Hill depletion is, from the Ogallala, is speculation in a
No,
sense.
it's not speculation.
Okay.
You could see it in the hydrographs of the rivers.
Okay.
If you put a hydrograph of the Smoky since 1950 and compare it to the development of groundwater in western Kansas, I think you'd see a nice correlation.
Okay, next we have Representative Vaughn. You have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Griggs, for your presentation. In regard to the GMD election turnout, I was wondering if you also inquired about the actual turnout and just not registration, because I assume those numbers are even lower, which would be further.
My timing couldn't have been worse, right? We are in a terrible drought. Western Kansas is blowing up. These guys are working hard. I don't have the courage to ask follow-up questions when they've already burned up half an hour on me, okay? But that, I'm sure, is something that they would have data on. I just said, look, Bert Griggs, how many registered voters you got? And that's kind of all I did. So that would be a useful piece of information to see what the actual voting is.
Yeah, I think ultimately I'm just concerned that, less than a fraction of 1% of people are making decisions for the entire groundwater district and the future of that region. And that kind of leads to my follow-up question, which, constitutionally, I would think that we have a precedent for one person, one vote, that voting rights shouldn't be tied to property rights. And I'm wondering if there's any constitutional precedent for that in your legal opinion.
The one vote, one person principle was established by the Supreme Court in the 1960s, largely in response to Voting Rights Act and civil rights challenges. And the Supreme Court carved out an exception. If you have a district such as a GMD that has a limited and targeted purpose, it enjoys the exception of not being subject to the one person, one vote rule. So, a good example in Kansas is we had a lawsuit over the Department of Agriculture, where environmental plaintiffs brought a suit arguing that the way in which the selection of the Kansas Board of Agriculture was done violated the one person, one vote principle. And the court, Judge Lundstrom, held that it does violate that principle. The 10th Circuit affirmed that. But that's because the Kansas Board of Agriculture is a statewide board with governance powers across the spectrum. Here we're dealing with a groundwater district composed mostly of water rights owners who have a proprietary interest in their water rights. And the court has routinely held that in that situation, the election rules on their face deserve this exception. But as applied, okay, there you can make a constitutional challenge on the face of the law. You can also make a constitutional challenge as applied. For example, GMD4, 24%, if my ballpark estimations are close, that seems to be pretty broad, but 0.27 of 1% doesn't. So how it works out in principle, how it works out given the city of Wichita or Garden and Dodge, is a more complicated issue. So I don't think you can make a facial challenge saying, well, this is just unconstitutional. Because the legislature clearly thought of that when it passed the GMD Act, but I don't know if the legislature saw how bad the problem would become.
Just a thought, maybe you ought to get a drop box, get all these extra voters.
One per county, right? Yeah.
Any other questions? Representative Highland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was intrigued by your discussion on the Clean Water Act. You said that second prong.
Yes.
And I'm going to ask, is it something the state should be doing, or should we be talking to our congressional representatives and asking them to help us out in this and work with the EPA from that end, or should we go ahead and sue Colorado?
Where is General Schmidt? That's a question for him. If I could design a perfect solution to this very hard problem, I would have Kansas, Colorado, EPA, and their respective congressional representatives see how we can leverage federal money and federal assistance to deal with this problem from Pueblo all the way to Great Bend. Colorado, in the 1960s, had the ear of Congress, and they passed what's called the Frying Pan Ark River Project. They knew they had a water quality problem in eastern Colorado, so guess what? Rural communities from Pueblo down to Lamar and La Junta get water piped across the Rocky Mountains from the Frying Pan River, just near Aspen, Colorado, and they get clean water. That project does not extend to Kansas. Colorado saw this problem. They've got this magnificent thing called gravity. Okay, they can move that water. To what extent can we, as a region, thinking about the basin, the Ark River Basin, from Leadville to Wichita, use federal assistance and the combined delegations of the states to try and get a handle on this? If you sue the state of Colorado, I can promise you, you are bringing knives to a gunfight, and you are going to be in uncharted legal territory where you're asking a 1949 compact that speaks to water quantity to be construed by the Supreme Court, 9 guys in DC who don't know much about water, extend that to water quality. It can be done. I mean, the word groundwater is not in the Republican River Compact. We got them to reduce groundwater pumping. But this is a regional federal system. The entire Clean Water Act is based on the principle of cooperative federalism, where you set standards and then you have the states work to meet those. If I could amend the Ark River Compact, if you could have a congressional magic wand, you could incorporate an interstate system of dealing with this water quality program, because you want to have the states deal with it. You do not want to surrender your future to whatever the Supreme Court says that year. That's a terrifying option.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, next we have Representative Minix on WebEx.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, I thought he was speaking. I'm not trying to run from Representative Minix.
There he is. Here we go.
I can't see the video of the room, so I'm talking to a white screen here, but Professor Griggs, I have a question about the relationship between the chief engineer and the Secretary of Agriculture. Has there ever been a Secretary of Agriculture that overruled the chief engineer? And secondly, if we elevated the chief engineer to a secretary level position or equivalent to the Secretary of Agriculture, would that eliminate some of the autonomy problems with the chief engineer?
In answer to your first question, the answer is yes. In 2017, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service had filed a request to secure water to protect its 1957 water right for the Quivira National Wildlife Refuge. The Division of Water Resources developed an administration plan to protect that senior water right that was being impaired by irrigators in the Rattlesnake Creek Basin. The chief engineer issued an impairment report in 2016 detailing the extent of the impairment, an impairment that ranges between 30 and 60,000 acre feet per year of groundwater base flow. To put that number in perspective, that's about the number. You split that in half, 45,000 acre feet, that's about the number the groundwater pumping in Nebraska was exceeding the Republican River Compact. So the chief engineer did his job, did an impairment report, prepared a plan to administer water rights, and was prepared to deploy that plan. But then the Secretary of Agriculture promised that water rights would not be administered by priority for the next year. Water rights of a junior priority to the wildlife refuge have yet to be administered, despite the Fish and Wildlife's request for such administration. So the thought experiment for this group is, what if instead of the National Wildlife Refuge there, you had a dairy milk drying facility with a 1957 water right, and it was being impaired by thousands of junior irrigation rights? Then the Secretary of Agriculture's interests and the chief engineer's interests align. First in time, first in right, let's build ag. Let's build ag value through places like dairies and milk processing plants. But here the interests did not align. The interest of agriculture conflicted with the rights of prior appropriation, and the Secretary of Agriculture overturned the chief engineer's plan, even though under 82A 1901, the Secretary of Agriculture does not have the legal authority to reverse the chief engineer's plans to protect senior water rights. That was a one-time but especially egregious example of that. And full disclosure, it's one of the reasons I'm part of a litigation effort to convince the Fish and Wildlife Service to protect its water right. So I'm happy to answer questions about that litigation. I don't want to hide that. You can see all the pleadings. They're all online. The second question you had was, what if we elevate the chief engineer to a cabinet position? I don't think that's a good idea, because now you've made the chief engineer a political appointee of the governor. The chief engineer is a classified employee. He or she, we don't have enough women chief engineers in this country, they have to be a certified, licensed professional engineer. The whole point is to insulate that office from political decisions. So I think something like what the legislature sponsored this spring about establishing some sort of water agency where the focus is on water, not how can we square the circle between water and agriculture, is where you would go. And so the chief engineer should be a classified official. They should be protected from political repercussions. If the chief engineer gets it wrong, there's this great thing. It's called judicial review. Sue the SOB. And if you got it wrong, you'll win. That's happened, okay? I've been on the losing end of one of those things, okay? We have judicial review of the chief engineer's decisions. He is not above the law, but he should be directly accountable to the law. He should not have to filter his conduct through a political appointee. So I think having an agency like natural resources or water in which the chief engineer is housed would be a way to establish water independently and to protect the chief engineer from political pressure.
Thank you for clarifying that very much. Appreciate it.
All right, I don't hear any other questions. Seeing none, Professor Griggs, thank you very much for your comments, and we'll see you later today. Committee, next we move up to Representative.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. When would you like to see me later in the day?
As soon as we get done with this, but that just.
I'm happy to come back, but I don't.
No, you're fine. I just figured you'd have to come back. So we're ready for Representative Newland to talk about his finance plan.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to speak a little bit about what we need to do or what has been proposed at one time or another to fund some water projects within our great state. For those of you that do not have a handout for the Blue Ribbon Task Force, there's a short one-pager over there if you'd like a copy of the summary. The Blue Ribbon Task Force was published or put together in 2015, and there were 7 times during 2016 they were met and ought to have to evaluate overall financial needs to implement the long-term vision of the future of water in the great state of Kansas. The task force came to a consensus that roughly $55 million in annual funds is needed for full implementation of this vision. Actual project expenditures will vary from year to year, but we know that many of our projects that need to be handled, as we've heard over the last few days, a couple days, funding is the most needed thing that we have. We cannot do any of these projects without a designated funding. So, to ensure the adequate revenue stream to support these funding needs, the Blue Ribbon Funding Task Force recommended the following. Existing fees into the State Water Plan Fund be maintained at the current levels. 1/10 of 1% of existing statewide sales tax be dedicated to funding the vision implementation. It is preferable that the dedication of the 1/10 of 1% sales tax be protected by the constitutional amendment. That would be very tough in my estimation. But at some point in time, the state has to do something necessary to fund these types of opportunities that we have. A review of all existing user fees by the legislature 5 years after successful collection of the sales tax to continue every 5 years thereafter. That the State General Fund and the EDF Fund statutory demand transfers be done. And that was supposed to be done for the years 17, 18, and 19. Well, we all know what has happened in those years. And not until this past session did we truly fund the State Water Office or State Water Plan. And the legislature of the KWA took a look at the statute relative to the makeup of the KWA and seek to include demographic and user fee participation as guidelines for representation and appointments. Let's be clear. What Chairman Highland did in the last 2 years is incredible. The level of water has risen to the perspective that to the level that we know something has to be done. And it cannot be kicked down the road. But we cannot do any of these projects without proper funding. Now, it was proposed and all that we take care of some of this by the 1/10 of 1%, which would be roughly around $50 million. But in some of these articles and all within that Blue Ribbon Task Force, it stated and all that we might reduce some of the fee structures on fertilizer and pesticides in the gravel. But as you can see, when the final determinations come out of their task force, that those were not to be. Those were supposed to be left in because we know that $50 million and the $12 million from the State General Fund and EDIF is still a drop in the bucket of what it's going to take to fund these projects that are so critical to our state. So these are a few things that the task force did for us. Well, now we're faced with the same situation here in 2022. And what do we do to go forward? I propose that in our discussions coming up here pretty quick, that we discuss some of these issues and make these kind of determinations that are so critical to our state. You know, we talk about the GMDs and the votings, who can vote for the positions on the GMDs. But I really think the major part for the GMDs right now is the reporting. And that was in that critical amendment also. So I'm going to leave you with that. This has been the opportunity that I've wanted to see that we actually fund what we can do for water. You know, we put $750 million back into a rainy day fund. We spent $80 million on reducing some debt And that was a tremendous effort right there in itself, just reducing some of the debt on our reservoirs. But we have a lot more to do, and I think this is part of that plan. With that, I would stand for questions then.
Okay, thank you very much, Representative Newland. Committee, any questions for Representative Newland? Senator Dahl, I didn't see your hand there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative, does this include the impact of what the elimination of food tax will have? Do you have that figured into this? That's $600 million a year once it all implemented. Is that
No,
put
that-
into this?
The food sales tax is totally separate, from this.
Well, it's going to be sales tax, 1/10 of 1% of sales tax, correct?
That is correct.
Well, that's food, that's sales
That
tax
is,
on food.
that is overall, all sales
Right,
tax.
so is that, when you were doing this figuring, did you have it figured in that the elimination of food tax?
No, this is, that reduction in, or that figure only accounts for what the Blue Ribbon Task Force asked for back in 2016. Has nothing to do with the food tax. Thank you.
Representative Rishu, please. You want to
Mr. Chair, thank you for the presentation. This is the first time that I've really taken a deep dive on all of this. Do you guys have a good measure of the actual effect that we would get out of this $55 million, right? Funding is great, but if it's a matter of $55 million a year will delay, depleting the aquifer by 2 years, there's still other plans that need to be made. So do we actually know the effect of this funding on the aquifer?
There are, in my estimation, there is no way to really measure anything as far as the effect of the depletion of the aquifer. But what we can see is if we implement some of these conservation practices, if we see that we can hire oversight, as we heard yesterday, 20% down in just people, EFTs. We have to be able to find the people, to help take care of these problems. And without this funding, I don't see anything going anywhere. We just continue to kick the can down the road.
Sure, thank you. And I totally agree. And I don't mind this. I'm a Democrat. Spending's okay. But it seems to me if we don't have additional plans, that will definitively stop the depletion of the aquifer, then just the $55 million is not going to be nearly enough. So I see it as maybe part of the solution, but I think more drastic measures will be needed. Thank you.
I think you're exactly right. Yeah.
Representative Highland.
Thank you. During our committee meetings, we discussed several items, and we were looking for new money. This item was brought up during our committee, obviously, and a bill was produced. But when it got to the point of decision-making by leadership, whether or not it really reached the floor or not, the question came up, legislative oversight. Because the way it's written, it will go straight into the water plan fund, but there won't be any oversight then by the legislature. So that was a big problem. We also talked about other new money. And one of them was money coming from the gambling that is just now being, but when they tacked on the amendment that the first $70 million goes to a stadium somewhere, that killed that as a revenue source. Have you thought of any other new money sources other than the 1/10%? Because as Senator Dahl said, with the reduction in sales tax on food, there will be a lot of people clamoring for what's left, and that 1% could be taken away fairly easily if we don't do the constitutional amendment, like you said, and that's very unlikely. So it would be a dogfight every year to try to get that money.
I don't disagree with you whatsoever. And to stand here and say that there's other funding mechanisms, you know as well as I do that that's a revolving door as far as sales tax usage year to year. So it will be a dogfight each year.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions for Representative Newland? Senator Ware.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in the thought of, perhaps new money, in reading over the Blue Ribbon thoughts, their historic actions, the idea of instituting a fee for water bottles seems pretty natural, water. And by itself would create a lot of money. But there was in reading it, not being there, it was very short, the explanation of, oh, that won't work. Why, is my question. What's the problem? Seems pretty like a great idea to me.
Well, I can't say what the task force was thinking about back then, for sure. But in the same area of thought, they wanted to decrease the fertilizer fees. They wanted to decrease pesticide fees by instituting fees on other things. And so I think their thought was to leave the structure of fees alone and add that 0.5% instead.
It looks to me like a great place to look anyway. I'd like to see what might happen
And it
with that.
could be, yeah. Everything's got to be on the table now.
Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you for your idea and you're bringing it today. We appreciate that very much, Joe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Oh, Representative Minix on WebEx. You have a question for Joe?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mainly a comment concerning Senator Dahl's question earlier. There's a couple things that have changed since this 2017 time period. We recently reduced the sales tax on food, but we've also greatly increased the sales tax on things that are ordered online. The compensating use tax has been far greater than originally anticipated. I think that's one of the reasons I keep tracking state revenues coming in, and sales tax revenue is always quite a bit more than anticipated. A lot of that change has been due to the online orders. And I think it'd be interesting to go back and look at our current situation and calculate that 1/10 cent sales tax and see what that would raise at this time. But I thank Representative Newland for his comments today.
Thank you, sir.
Anybody else? Question? Thank you very much. Committee, we've reached the point where that extends all the length of our conferees for this interim. You notice we have time for discussion, questions, and recommendations. We're not going to be taking any votes or anything on this committee level, but I think the best way to say it is, where do we go from here, from what we've talked about in the last 2 days, and what needs to be on the radar that we need to get copies of some of these things. I think Professor Griggs pretty well sobered a lot of people up, including myself, on the immensity of what could be if we don't do something. And so that's what we'll just leave it open for discussion. So we're not going to vote on anything, but we're going to give us some direction from where we go from here, what's important. So to you and to the state and everybody else. So we'll open that up. That's Representative Highland.
Well, let's stick to one topic at a time. Let's jump into funding. And I would recommend that we study, number one, the new money aspect, possibly a tax on bottled water. We need to have research look into that to see how much money could be gained. I like ice cream, by the way. And see if that is something that could be done, and look at different values of percentage on that tax to see what kind of money that would raise. Number two, we looked into looking at increasing the fees on water across the state. But that we ran into a brick wall because the GMDs have their own taxing entity, and there was a disparity between what they're paying and what the municipal users and everybody else in the state, stock water users, all of them are using in industry. So that one, until we have the audit on the GMDs, we really don't have a handle on that one yet. Third, we looked at also the gambling. I don't think that's viable. But the new one, the compensating use tax that Representative Minix mentioned, that's a new one I had not considered that we may try to carve out. But then we have the second part of the problem is everybody demands legislative oversight of all this. One way is to have them go before the legislature every year and ask for that. Or the second way, in our committee, we came up with a trust fund idea, which would have participants on that trust fund, the board, from the legislature. So with that, then the money goes into the trust fund, but it cannot be spent without that board approval. And we looked at it as a viable opportunity to handle the situation. It protects the money that goes in there, but it still has oversight how it's spent. The groups have to come into the board and plead their case and so forth. And that looked like a possibility as a solution to protect that money for water in the future. That's my thoughts on funding. Thank you.
And staff, you getting the notes on these suggestions? Thank you. Representative Reichman. Oh, Senator Reichman.
I'm just not going to say anything. I'm going to go on. Now I changed my thought pattern when it's. This is the first time I've been on this water committee, and it's been very, very enlightening, also very, very sobering. When the professor came forward today and what he shared, and now we're talking about different ways that we want to bring in more money, and our representative over there, he asked, I thought, a very pertinent question, is that how much money are we talking about and what do we use it for? And if you're ever thinking about bringing in extra money, and some of you have an idea what we're talking about, what we're going through. I don't, okay? And I just know that, I mean, this may just be just a little drop in the water, what we need, I don't know. The point is that we got to know how much money we need before you're going to ask any representatives or senators. Very few are going to vote for increase without knowing where it's going to be put. That was, and what you're saying for different ways of getting money and oversight, I think, are very valid. And I think those are good points. And I don't have an answer. I'm just asking this question. I think we need to have that discussion before we decide how much money. Thank you.
Any other thoughts? Senator Dahl, there you are.
I'm not advocating this whatsoever, but the solution is fairly simple. You pass the cannabis, and you're going to have more dadgum money. You know, look at Colorado, look at those other ones. I'm not saying I'd even vote for it, but that's an easy solution if you want. If that's, you know, sometimes you want to solve the problem, but that would pay for it.
Representative Hsu, please.
Thank you, Senator. Just to put a little bit of a finer point on what I was trying to say earlier, I think we just need to make sure we cannot just pass a funding mechanism such as this and pat ourselves on the back and call it a day. We have to make sure whatever we do is a sustainable solution, that Kansas has enough water for all of our interests forever. And so I just want to make that very, very explicit on whatever we need to do, that needs to happen. Because like the professor said, if we do not do that, then we need to come up with a plan for Western Kansas to move or change industries or vastly change their way of life, which I don't think is in anybody's best interest. Thank you.
All right. Anybody else? Representative Vaughn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And building on the former speaker's comments as well as some earlier comments, I think all these things are really interrelated. Something that we also found in our committee work is that in order to maximize the impact of these dollars, it's going to make sense to look at reorganization. You know, when we originally advocated for full funding of the state water plan, those monies are spread across 3 different agencies and, you know, different departments and organizations, and there's some overlap in those funding items. And ultimately, I think the 55 million and fully funding the water vision as defined by the Blue Ribbon Task Force is a really excellent goal. And there are programs established that those monies have been identified for. So I think the funding is a key part of this, but I think it's also a conversation about reorganization. How are we maximizing those dollars? How are we creating independence and looking at the policy side of this issue as well to ensure that we're not just putting more money into the issue, but that we're also addressing the fundamental problem of running out of water and what are we going to do about it? Because we can put all the money we want into that, but if we don't change our mindset, if we don't change the way that we approach this issue, then ultimately nothing is going to change. And we're going to be in the same position that we were in 1989 when they passed this original $8 million. And we're still here talking about it and asking for more funds. And that money is important, but I think this is a larger conversation too. And so I'm really excited to be here and to be part of this larger conversation because I think all of those things are interrelated. And I look forward to continuing the discussion, whether that's a group specifically focused on funding or, you know, continuing this conversation into next session because I think it's a big part of it, but I think it's all connected too. Thank you.
Representative Highland.
Just a couple comments to Senator Reichman's comments. As a committee, we ask every one of these groups and agencies to come to us and say, what would the money be used for? We do have that information. And it was going to take quite a bit of money to do the things they needed. Plus, the one area that was brought out earlier in testimony was the amount of money we're leaving on the table by not asking for the grant money. We just don't have the personnel or the people with the expertise to write those grants and so forth. And I did get one estimate from KDHE, and it was 7.1 million that has been left on the table there. I did not get estimates from everyone else, but it's a lot of money that could help in the future, but we have to have adequate funding to match because most all those grants are a matching situation. So we do have that information. It has been gathered. It needs to be shared with everyone. It's there, but we were all busy for 90 days or less, and it's difficult to share that with everyone all the time. But thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Representative Newland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't think there's any doubt, as Representative Highland was saying, that our agencies don't have a specific plan of what to do with these funds. We all know that 80% of the water is being used by irrigators and all, and there are plans, there are ways that we can cut back in those areas and that we have to cut back in those areas. But it takes money, you know, to get this thing done. If we want to save the Ogallala, you know, there is the prime source. You know, we have more dairies moving in. We've had more feedlots built over the years. We've gone, in fact, from the 40s and all, we've gone from set-aside acres every year to full production. So we have to utilize somehow ways to cut back the water usage in agriculture. There is no doubt. And we have to use those conservation practices that are available to us now. But it takes money and it takes help in order to get those practices instilled and done. So, thank you.
You're welcome. I might like to add what we haven't talked about recently here, but what the role the GMD is going to play in this plan. And we know that they're an integral part because that's the local end of it to come up with. I would charge them to come with us a plan of their own, that the GMDs put together a conservation plan, if it's something new or whatever it is, and so we can participate in the whole discussion of everything else, because that's where the control is, that's where the water is, And so let's not overlook them, and we don't need to be going to court to settle disputes over water on local issues. So there's a lot of things we don't want, we're wasting time on instead of concentrating on how we fix a real important problem like this. So I extend that challenge to them. Bring us a plan, work with us, and let's get some moving forward and make this thing work. Senator Ware.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, in my experience trying to develop a new idea, the best way to get a real solution, not just an answer, is to have all of the stakeholders at the table. And like you were saying just now, the GMD folk, who else have we not heard directly from that would be an important stakeholder that needs to be at that table discussion?
Well, in this discussion today, we don't have the large municipalities speaking. And the end users, you know, the houses, the people that live in those homes, whether it's in the country or in a town, we haven't heard from them. We did at the committee level, but that information, you're right, everybody needs to come to the table because it involves everybody. No matter what end of the state you live on, this is a serious situation.
I think we have a question from Representative Minix. Are you there?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to fill in a few things. We need to share knowledge with people all across the state. I get comments that with new dairy coming in, or cheese factory coming into the Dodge City area, it's going to deplete the Ogallala aquifer that much quicker. It's my understanding that the GMD area is closed to new development, and any additional water or any water that's needed for dairies must be purchased from existing water rights. And during that application, there's a conversion in about a 30% roughly, and it's something I should have asked Chief Engineer Earl Lewis yesterday. It's my understanding that about a 30% reduction will actually happen due to the cheese factory coming into that area. If I'm incorrect, hopefully there's a technician there in the room that can straighten that out.
A question, did the Chief Engineer answer that question he just brought up? Thank you.
You bet. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Representative Mix, for that question. It's kind of I'll give you a two-part answer. First, he's correct that when we have any new industry, such as the cheese plant come in, especially in a closed area, which is Ford County certainly is, the industry has to purchase or get water supply from an existing source. And there is a conversion, a consumptive use calculation, which goes into that. In Ford County, it varies county to county, but in Ford County, it's about 85% of the authorized quantity is what would get converted over to industrial use to be used by the cheese factory. That doesn't necessarily result in an overall reduction in the water use, because that consumptive use calculation is supposed to make sure. You think about irrigation, some years, like this year, we're using a lot. If we get a wet year like 2019, we don't use very much. And so we average that over time, where if you think about a city or an industry, you're going to be using the majority of your water right pretty consistently every time. And so that's the consumptive use calculation, is to make sure that we don't increase the consumptive use in that conversion and protect other water rights. So, he's right in that there's no new water rights being issued out there.
If I could ask, is the conversion at the dairy level, is it a 15% reduction roughly also?
Yeah, again, it varies county by county, but if it went to either the facility there in Dodge, or if it went from irrigation to the dairy, providing that milk, then it would also be a reduction of about 15%, because we consider those dairies to be stock water, not irrigation. Again, we would expect that they're going to use a pretty consistent amount of water every year, rather than that fluctuation we see in irrigation.
Thank you very much.
Representative Howerton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have enjoyed these conversations, and it's starting to sink in after hearing it once during committee, and I appreciate that. I would like to add to the people to bring to the table, it's not just the GMDs, but there's, they mentioned 105 conservation districts that are at a local level, and then there's 14 district water advisory committees, and then even KDHE has 6 district offices that are all there at that local level that, so I don't think it just falls on the GMDs for sure, but I am looking forward to finding these answers. I think the history we can be so proud of in Kansas of how our, as he put it, our great-grandparents and probably great-great-grandparents took these actions, historic actions that have benefited us well today, and we can continue that.
Any other comments, questions? Oh, does somebody want to mention something other than funding? We've talked about it quite a bit.
Yes.
Senator Ware.
Thank you. Yes. One thing aside from funding that I think is critical in everything that I've been hearing for the last 2 days and reading up on is to have the chief engineer able to do his job in whatever manner that calls for. Perhaps moving from one situation to another. I think that would be a very important part of it.
Representative Highland?
Well, since Senator Ware brought up the topic of reorganization, our committee delved into this very deeply. And my recommendation was that we have a secretary position put in place that met with problems. But with the Blue Ribbon Committee, I believe it was, one of them recommended a sub-cabinet level. A group, let's just call it the coordinator, the Water and Natural Resource Coordinator. Let's put that put in place. And then we move the chief engineer out from under KDA, classified position, standalone. But information flows from there up to the coordinator office when it comes to funding and all of that. Conservation is going to be key for the future of all of this, and for funding and for their activities. So we took them out of the Department of Agriculture and put them also underneath that coordinator. KDHE, we moved the water section out of KDHE and put that outside as well. And when we did that, it kind of put everything together, and you have less stepping on each other. And the one slide that I wanted to show you have in your packet, you had the color code for the organizations. If you turn that page over, that has them set out to where you look at it and you see how much overlap these groups had. It's the one sheet, the color, it has the color code, turn it over, yeah, that's where the overlap is. And if you look at that, you see that several function areas need to be spread out some so that you can see who's doing what and where. And you can do that by moving these folks out into this one umbrella organization. So I think it's something that in the committee or the future we need to look at is reorganizations to where the water becomes a separate function. The funding is looked at and watched over carefully by a board possibly. And with that, the reorganization, I think, is also key in the future of how we deal with water.
Any other comments? Senator Ware.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The idea of education is critical to this, obviously, so that we can have basically rural buy-in. Because they do have conflicting interests. I mean, it's easy to see. It's today or long-term. Which are we going to choose? And they need to understand why long-term is today.
Representative Highland.
One more thing, as a committee, we traveled to Garden City for one of our committee meetings, off-site. And one of the alarming things for me was, after the committee meeting, we visiting with the local folks that live in that area, they would come up to you off to the side, and they'd say, we know we have to do something. They want to do something done. But they would also say, we can't do it by ourselves, we need your help. So we have to give them the help they want. We don't want to overstep what, as a state, we don't want to get involved in their affairs unless we have to. But we have, it's a sociology or psychology problem too. We have those users that tell you point blank, I'm going to pump it till it's dry and then I'm going to move away. So you have that attitude. Then you have the other end of the spectrum and say, I want to keep something for my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren. So we have to recognize that that is a problem in this situation. And we have to figure out how to deal with that as well.
Committee, any others? I don't want to drag it out of you, so we're close to adjourn. I'm going to call for to adjourn the committee. Unless there's any other comments that want to be made. Representative Vaughn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Really just a comment to support my chair's recommendations. I know a lot of work went into creating that proposal and talking about the interrelated nature of all of these things. I think going back to the other representative from Sedgwick County's comments, the independence of the chief engineer is really central to this, and we saw that in our presentation from Professor Griggs today, of the fact that the chief engineer has the authority under law to protect these private property rights, these water rights, that, you know, to make sure that what we're doing is in the best interest of all Kansans and allowing them to determine their own destinies. But right now, the structure that we created and the way that the law is working isn't benefiting Kansans, and it's benefiting, you know, the mining of the water, the short term, not the long term, and ensuring that we have a future that's sustainable and that can ensure the continuation of the western part of our state and those communities. So I think all of these things are really important to that. Looking at an organization that is going to prioritize water without a conflict of interest inherent to the biggest industry that uses that resource, you know, making sure that the agency that's responsible for regulating that resource is independent and remains classified, and that we have the funding necessary to achieve all of these projects. So I just wanted to reiterate my support for the previous comments and to say that I hope we continue this conversation along all of those lines and not just focus on one, because I think they're all very important. So with that, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I would say too that don't limit your remarks to this building and this committee. If you have ideas, come forward and let's talk about them. Let's get everybody to participate if you've got good suggestions. So. I think if they're general in nature, we'll just make a list and for now. Committee, I'm seeing no other questions. We are adjourned.
Question. A lot of things are thrown out, but the idea of trying to what I said, I can't find it. Opposite. God sitting in and we're
So you're watching this for the counties?
yeah, I mean, I saw recently, representing rural counties.
but also Central other counties. This really affects
That's what I was trying to say.